blade was cold, a sliver of merciless moonlight against her skin. Hannah Lynch stared into the eyes of the man before her, eyes as dark and vast as the prairie night. Around them, the circle of Apache warriors was silent, a jury of shadows waiting for a verdict written in blood. The man, Kale, the warrior she had saved, now knelt before her, his hand steadying hers as she held the knife to her own flesh. His voice was a raw whisper, a breaking wave against the shore of her fear. "They need to see it, Hannah. They need to see that your heart bleeds the same color as mine." Her heart hammered, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. She had given him water to save his life. Now, to save both of theirs, he was asking her to spill her own blood. He wasn't just asking for trust. He was asking for a piece of her soul, a sacrifice under the unforgiving western sky. And as the warriors leaned closer, their faces grim masks of anticipation, Hannah knew this was no longer about survival. It was about a love so fierce and wild it demanded everything. Part 1. A Shadow at the Well. The sun was a tyrant, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth of the Lynch homestead. It was a merciless heat that baked the very soul out of the land, leaving it gasping and barren. Hannah Lynch, her face shielded by a worn straw hat, felt a bead of sweat trace a path down her neck, a salty reminder of her endless toil. Since her husband, Jebediah, had been taken by the winter fever, the ranch had begun to crumble around her. Fence posts sagged like weary old men, the water barrels were dangerously low, and the well, her lifeline, seemed to be sighing its last shallow breaths. Loneliness was a constant heavy cloak, as oppressive as the summer sun. She was wrestling with a stubborn coil of fence wire, her hands raw and scratched, when a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision made her freeze. She squinted, her eyes scanning the shimmering heat haze that distorted the distant mesquite trees. There, crumpled against the cool, dark stones of the old well, was a figure. A man. Her first thought was that the heat was playing tricks on her, conjuring phantoms from the dust. But as she took a hesitant step closer, her heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. This was no phantom. His long black hair was matted with dried blood and dirt. His shirt, once perhaps a light color, was torn and stained with a dark, ugly bloom of crimson. He was Apache. The words screamed through her mind, a jolt of pure, primal fear. The stories from town, whispered over saloon counters and general store barrels, flooded back in a terrifying rush. Raids, violence. Barns burned to the ground. Families slaughtered. The Apache were ghosts of the prairie, instruments of a brutal, unforgiving justice. Every instinct, honed by tales of terror, shrieked at her to run, to bar the door, to grab Jebediah's old rifle. Yet, she was rooted to the spot. Something held her captive. He wasn't moving to attack. In fact, he looked half dead, a broken doll discarded by a cruel child. As she watched, his dark eyes fluttered open. They were deep-set, framed by thick lashes, and for a fleeting second, they fixed on her. There was no strength in his gaze, only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. He was an enemy, the embodiment of the dangers her neighbors constantly warned of. It would be so simple to turn her back, walk into the relative safety of her cabin, and let the merciless sun finish what his enemies had started. No one would know. No one would blame her. But then, a soft, ragged breath escaped his lips, a sound so fragile it seemed to tear at the fabric of the oppressive silence. It was a sound of desperation, of a life clinging on by the thinnest of threads. She saw past the warrior, past the blood and the perceived threat, and saw only a man in agony. Her gaze flickered toward the house, then back to him. His lips, cracked and pale, moved. It was not a word, but the ghost of one, a shape, a desperate plea. Water, Dart. A knot of conflict tightened in her chest, so fierce it stole her breath. This was madness. This was a betrayal of her people, of Jebediah's memory. But as she looked at him, at his vulnerability, she saw not an enemy, but a reflection of her own struggle. She too was fighting to survive on this unforgiving land, battling her own silent wars against loneliness and despair. With a resolve she didn't know she possessed, she moved cautiously forward, her boots stirring the fine dust. She knelt just out of his reach, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. His breathing was shallow, his hands limp at his sides, fingers slightly curled as if reaching for something that wasn't there. He was younger than she had first thought, his features sharp and defined even under the grime and pain. Carefully, her movements deliberate, she filled her tin cup from the well's bucket. The water was cool against the metal. She shuffled closer, the scent of dust and blood filling her nostrils, and tipped the cup toward his lips. He drank with a slow, agonizing effort, as if even the simple act of swallowing was a monumental task. His eyes, however, never left hers. They were dark, intense, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of something beyond pain. Surprise, perhaps. Gratitude. After he had taken a few sips, his head fell back against the stone wall of the well, his chest rising and falling with a slightly more steady rhythm. He was still. Hannah remained crouched, the empty cup in her trembling hand, the magnitude of her action crashing down on her. She had given aid to an Apache. In the eyes of her neighbors, she had just signed her own death warrant. Yet, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and stretching long, skeletal shadows across the cracked ground, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She couldn't look at the man by her well and see a monster. All she saw was a human being, broken and bleeding, a kindred spirit in a land that seemed determined to break them both. As she walked back to the house, the silence of the prairie pressing in on her, she whispered into the twilight, a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. God help me. She had a chilling certainty that she had just invited a storm into her life, a storm that might wash away everything she had. Part 2. The Ring of Warriors. Sleep was a stranger to Hannah that night. She lay rigid in her bed, Jebediah's old quilt pulled up to her chin, though the night was warm. Every creak of the wind through the rafters of the small cabin sounded like a stealthy footstep. Every whisper of the cottonwood leaves outside her window became a hissed warning. Her mind was a maelstrom, spinning with terrifying possibilities. Had the man by the well crawled away into the darkness to die? Or worse, was he still out there, his strength returning? His mind now bent on the vengeance the townsfolk always spoke of. The water she'd given him could be seen not as kindness, but as a foolish woman's weakness, an invitation to take more. By the time the first pale, gray light of dawn seeped through the window, she couldn't bear the suspense any longer. Throwing her shawl over her thin nightdress, she unbarred the door and stepped outside. The cool morning air was a shock against her skin, raising goosebumps on her arms. Her eyes went immediately to the well. It was empty. There was no trace of him. The tin cup lay where she had left it, half filled with dust, a lonely sentinel to the night's events. A long, shuddering breath escaped her, and her shoulders, tense all night, finally slumped in relief. It was over. He had moved on. It was someone else's problem now, or no one's at all. She had acted foolishly, but fate had spared her the consequences. She turned back toward the simple comfort of her home, her mind already turning to the day's chores when the ground began to tremble. At first, it was a faint, low vibration, a distant rumble that she might have mistaken for thunder, had the sky not been a clear, cloudless blue. But it grew, steadily, insistently, rising from a murmur to a deep, percussive roar. It was a sound that spoke of power, of weight, of speed. Her breath hitched in her throat. Horses. Lots of them. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, just as they crested the ridge. It was a vision from a nightmare, a scene from the most terrifying campfire stories. Warriors. At least 20 of them, maybe more, flowing over the rise like a dark, unstoppable river. Their faces were painted with stark, geometric lines of black and vermilion. Eagle feathers, tied into their long, dark hair, trailed behind them in the wind. They moved with a terrifying fluid grace, their ponies weaving through the mesquite and sagebrush like silent, deadly shadows. There was no shouting, No war cries, only the thunder of hooves and the grim, unyielding silence of the riders. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. They didn't ride past. They slowed, fanning out with practiced precision, until they had formed a perfect menacing line, surrounding her small, vulnerable ranch. Every rider's gaze was locked onto her, unblinking, intense. She was the epicenter of their attention, a lone, terrified figure in a circle of predators. She felt her blood run cold, her legs turning to water. This was it. This was the price for her moment of compassion. Then, the warrior at the center of the line dismounted. He moved with an authority that set him apart. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a deerskin shirt. A jagged scar, old and white, ran from his temple down to his jaw, a brutal line that gave his face a permanent, fierce cast. And despite the war paint that obscured his features, despite the feathers in his hair, despite the aura of lethal power that radiated from him, she recognized him. It was the man she had given water to, the man from the well. He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate, each one a hammer blow against her fragile composure. His dark eyes were fixed on hers, and in their depths she saw none of the weakness she'd seen before. Now they held an ancient, unreadable power that paralyzed her. Her hand, of its own accord, tightened on the door frame of her cabin, her knuckles white. She had Jebediah's rifle inside, but she knew it would be useless. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could only watch as her fate walked toward her. He stopped just inches away, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His face was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the terrifying army at his back. Without breaking eye contact, he raised one hand, palm outward, in a clear gesture. At the signal, his warriors dismounted in unison, their movements silent and economical, forming a second tighter circle around her on foot. They were an imposing, silent wall of muscle and menace. "What do you want?" She finally forced the words out. Her voice was a shaky, pathetic whisper that was immediately swallowed by the vast, silent prairie. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze dropped for a moment. He reached into a leather satchel at his side and pulled something out. It was her tin cup. The rim was still stained with a faint trace of his blood, but it was unmistakably hers. Her breath caught in a painful gasp. Her mind screamed at her to run, to scream, to do something, but her feet felt as if they had grown roots into the dusty ground. The Apache warrior held the cup up, his gaze never wavering from hers. And then, with a single, slow, deliberate nod, he dropped it at her feet. The tin hit the packed earth with a dull, echoing clang. In that sound, in that simple, final gesture, Hannah knew. Whatever she had started yesterday with an act of kindness was far from over. It had just begun. Part 3. A debt of water, a promise of blood. The air was thick, stifling, each particle of dust seeming to hang suspended in the tense silence. Hannah stared at the tin cup lying at her feet, a humble, dented object that had become a terrifying symbol. A silent accusation. A verdict. Behind the warrior, the circle of his men remained unmoving. Stoic statues whose eyes burned into her, making her feel stripped bare, her soul exposed to their judgment. The warrior, Kale, as she would come to know him, took another step. His presence was towering, casting a long shadow that engulfed her completely. In his dark eyes, she searched for the rage she expected, the cruelty the stories promised. But it wasn't there. Instead, she saw a depth that ran deeper than her well, a profound, ancient stillness she couldn't begin to fathom. This was not the fury of a savage. It was the gravity of a king. "You gave me water," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a stone dropped into the silent pool of her fear. Hannah's knees wobbled. "Yes," she managed to choke out, the words scratching her dry throat. He held her gaze. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous, a knife poised to sever her fragile composure. "Why? Why had she done it? The reasons felt foolish and flimsy now, under the weight of 20 warriors' stares. Because I couldn't stand the sight of a man dying. Because the loneliness was a heavier burden than the fear. Because for a single, fleeting moment, I saw myself in your eyes, a soul fighting to survive in a world that wanted it gone. She licked her lips, her eyes darting nervously to the unyielding faces surrounding her. The wrong answer, she felt with chilling certainty, would see her home trampled to dust, her body left bleeding in the dirt. I couldn't let you die, she said finally, her voice trembling but honest. Not like that. A flicker of something. Was it surprise? Respect? Softened his gaze for a fraction of a second. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were searching her soul for the lie, for the deceit he had been taught to expect. He found none. You helped me, he stated, taking another deliberate step closer. The space between them now was intimate, charged. Now, I help you. Help? Hannah's heart stuttered. The word was so incongruous, so utterly alien to the situation. This couldn't be right. Men like him, she'd been told, didn't help women like her. They didn't repay kindness. They took, and they left a trail of blood and tears in their wake. You don't owe me anything, she said quickly, her voice rising with a note of desperation. I just gave you some water. Please, just go. The debt is not to you, he cut in, his jaw clenching. His gaze lifted from her face, sweeping across the barren fields, the dilapidated barn with its sagging roof, the skeletal fence posts that swayed in the hot wind. It is to your land. Her brow furrowed in confusion. My land. He nodded, his eyes returning to hers, burning with an intensity that held her fast. Water is life. This land is dying. You gave me the gift of life when mine was draining into the dust. Now, I will protect yours. Protect? The word coiled around her heart, a strange vine that was equal parts hope and terror. Did he mean protect her ranch from others? Protect her from his own men? Protect her life? Before she could voice her confusion, he lifted his chin, and his voice took on a note of command, a resonant authority that sent a shiver down her spine and made the warriors behind him straighten, as if pulled by an invisible string. We stay, Wine. It was not a request. It was a decree. At his words, the warriors moved with silent purpose. Some began leading the ponies toward the barn. Others headed for the well, their movements economical and sure. The air, already thick with tension, now crackled with a new energy, the energy of an army taking up its position, preparing for a siege. Hannah opened her mouth to protest, to demand an explanation, to scream that she didn't want this, but the warrior gave her one last, long look. It was a look that said everything and nothing, a look that sealed a pact she had never agreed to. Then, without another word, he turned his back on her and walked toward the barn, his stride confident, as if he had always belonged there. Hannah stood rooted to the spot, her heart thundering a chaotic rhythm of fear and disbelief. The tin cup lay in the dust, a severed link to the simple life she had known just yesterday. She had given a dying man a drink of water. Now an Apache war chief and his entire band had laid claim to her land, installing themselves as its guardians. And the most terrifying part of it all was that she had no idea if they were there to save her or to be her executioners. Part 4. The scent of blood and doubt. The barn, which had long echoed with emptiness, now groaned under the weight of men and horses. The air was thick with the unfamiliar, earthy smell of animal sweat, leather, and the low murmur of a language Hannah couldn't understand. She stood in the wide doorway, a stranger in her own space, her eyes darting from one warrior to the next. Some sat on upturned crates, sharpening knives with whetstones, the blades glinting ominously in the hazy shafts of light piercing the gloom. In the far corner, Cale sat with his back against a wooden post. His eyes were closed, his face pale and drawn beneath the streaks of dried blood and fading paint. The makeshift bandage she had wrapped around his shoulder the day before was soaked through with fresh blood, a raw, oozing testament to a wound far more serious than she had realized. A knot of guilt and fear tightened in her stomach. These men were not just warriors. They were brothers, a clan. And the man they followed, their leader, was wounded, vulnerable. Because of her. Before she could retreat back into the sunlight, a tall warrior with a brutal scar slashing through his brow stepped forward. His name, she would learn, was Gorak. And his eyes were as hard and unforgiving as granite. He spoke directly to Kale, his voice sharp, the Apache words clipped and aggressive. He gestured angrily, first at the wound, then at Hannah. Kale's eyes slowly opened. His gaze, heavy with pain, slid to Hannah for a moment, an unreadable flicker in their depths, before returning to Gorak. He answered in a calm, deliberate tone, his voice like gravel crunching underfoot. Though she didn't understand the words, she understood the intent. He was placating him. Gorak's expression only darkened. He spat a furious response, his fists clenching at his sides. For a terrifying second, Hannah was certain he would lunge at her, that the fragile piece would shatter. But instead, in a move that stunned her, Gorak dropped to one knee, bowing his head to his wounded chief. An apology? A concession? Kale spoke one last time, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Gorak rose, threw one last glare of pure venom at Hannah, then stalked away, barking orders to the other men, who immediately busied themselves with their horses and gear. Hannah's knees trembled. What had just transpired? A challenge? A power play? Come, Kale said, his voice pulling her from her daze. His eyes were locked on hers. Sit. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to flee. The gazes of the other warriors felt like physical blows, a wall of suspicion and hostility. The air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and something deeper. Something ancient, like earth after a storm. But Kale's stare was compelling. Reluctantly, she stepped forward, the straw crunching beneath her boots as she sank to the ground beside him. He winced, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. "Let me look at that," she heard herself say, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was the healer in her, the farmer's wife who knew how to mend both fences and flesh. He stiffened, his jaw tightening. But after a moment's hesitation, he gave a slight nod. Gently, her fingers trembling, she peeled away the blood-soaked cloth. The wound was worse than she'd imagined. A deep, angry gash, the skin around it swollen and hot to the touch. It was infected. Without a second thought, she reached for the water bucket she used for the livestock, dipped her own clean handkerchief in, and began to dab gently at the edges of the wound. Kale hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his muscles tensing beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. He watched her, his expression a mixture of pain and intense scrutiny. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice soft, needing to fill the charged silence, to distract them both. "Kale," he said, the name a rasp. "Kale," she repeated, testing the sound on her tongue. "I'm Hannah." His eyes met hers, and in that moment, the world outside the barn fell away. The hostile warriors, the crushing fear, the impossible situation, it all dissolved. All she saw was the man she had pulled back from the brink of death with a simple cup of water. His gaze lingered, and she felt a strange, unfamiliar heat spread through her chest. It was a connection, a spark in the darkness, something wild and unnamed. Just then the barn door creaked open, breaking the spell. Gorak stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, his eyes blazing with a cold fury as he saw her touching his chief. Hannah tensed, her breath catching. Kale sat up straighter, his own expression hardening, a protective shield slamming down. Gorak spoke, his words a venomous hiss. And even though Hannah couldn't understand the language, the meaning was brutally clear. She does not belong here. She's the cause of this. She is weakness. But the way Kale looked at her, the subtle way his hand hovered protectively near hers, told her something else entirely. She was no longer just a stranger, a white woman who had offered a moment of pity. She was a part of his story now. She was the reason for his pain, and the object of his protection. She was the center of the storm, and there was no turning back. Part 5. The Test of Blood. Night fell like a shroud, heavy and thick, the sky choked with clouds that smothered the moon and stars. The barn loomed like a dark, hulking beast against the prairie. Inside, the warriors had built a small, contained fire. The flames danced and writhed, casting their flickering, distorted shadows onto the walls, and the grim faces of the men circled around it. Hannah sat on a wooden crate by the door, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to hold her splintering courage together. She was an island in a sea of silent hostility. Her eyes darted to Cale every few seconds. He sat apart from the others, his back against the main support beam, his face drawn and pale with pain. The new bandage she had fashioned from a torn piece of her own petticoat was already showing ominous dark stains of blood. He was losing too much. Gorak, the scarred warrior, paced the barn floor like a restless wolf, his contempt for Hannah a palpable force in the room. He kept throwing venomous glances from Cale to her, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Finally, he stopped and addressed the group, his voice sharp, a blade cutting through the heavy air. Whatever he said, it resonated with the others. They murmured in agreement, their heads nodding, their dark eyes turning as one to stare at Hannah. She was the subject of their venom. She was the disease. Cale sat still, his face an unreadable mask. Then he spoke. His voice was steady but low, each word seeming to cost him a precious drop of his waning strength. Gorak's eyes blazed. He took a menacing step toward his chief, fists balled at his sides, his body radiating violence. "No!" Hannah gasped, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. Were they going to fight over her? Cale raised a hand, palm outward, a gesture of command that, even in his weakened state, held immense power. Gorak halted, his chest heaving, nostrils flaring. The barn fell utterly silent. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the mournful howl of the wind outside. Slowly, painfully, Cale pushed himself to his feet. He swayed slightly as a fresh wave of pain lanced through him, and Hannah shot to her feet, her heart a wild drum. "Cale!" He didn't look at her. His entire focus was on Gorak. He stepped closer, closing the distance until they stood nose to nose, the air between them crackling with a tense, electric energy. When Cale spoke again, his voice was calm, controlled, yet it carried a weight of authority that made the hairs on Hannah's neck stand on end. Gorak sneered, muttered a curse under his breath, then spun on his heel and stormed out of the barn, slamming the heavy door behind him. The others remained still, their eyes flicking from Cale to Hannah, their loyalty hanging in a precarious balance. Cale exhaled, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders, leaving him looking frail and exhausted. When he turned to Hannah, his expression was hard, his eyes as dark and turbulent as the storm gathering outside. "You must go inside," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Lock the doors, now." Hannah shook her head, a surge of defiance cutting through her fear. "No, not until you tell me what's going on." "What did he say?" His jaw clenched. "He said you are a threat, that I am weak for protecting you." "A threat?" She almost laughed, a hysterical sound that died in her throat. "I gave you water. I tried to help you." "That is why," he said, his eyes burning into hers. "You gave water to an enemy of his clan. Now they do not know whose side you are on." His words hit her like a physical blow. She had stumbled into a conflict far older and more complex than she could imagine. "I didn't know," she whispered, her mouth as dry as sand. "I didn't know you were an enemy to them." Cale stepped closer, his face inches from hers. The scent of earth and blood and wood smoke clung to him, an intoxicating, dangerous mix. "You still don't," he said softly. They stood like that for a long moment, the fire crackling behind them, the barn pressing in like the walls of a tomb. Her heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. A strange current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm they stood on the edge of. This was more than a debt of water. This was something else, something primal and terrifyingly new. She saw in his eyes not just a warrior, but a man, and she felt a desperate, reckless urge to reach out, to touch the scar on his face, to soothe the pain in his gaze. "You need to go inside," he said again, his voice softer this time, laced with an urgency that was for her safety, not his. "Lock the doors. Do not come out until I say." "And what about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Cale's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "I will stay. I must." He turned away, his shoulders rigid, and walked back to the fire, taking his seat among the silent, watching warriors, their eyes glittering like wolves in the dark. Hannah backed away toward the cabin, her skin crawling. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it a warning. Something was coming. A test. The next day dawned blood red. The warriors were moving about the ranch, a silent, efficient force, repairing her broken fences, watering her livestock. But it was not an act of kindness. It was an act of occupation. The door to her cabin burst open without warning. Gorak and another warrior stepped inside. They grabbed her by the arms, their grips like iron bands, and hauled her out into the yard. "No," she cried, struggling against them. "Let me go." They dragged her into the center of the circle of warriors and shoved her to her knees in the dirt in front of Cale. He stood over her, his face a mask of stone, fresh blood seeping through his bandage. Gorak stepped forward, a long, curved blade in his hand. The metal gleamed in the dying light. He held it up for all to see, then pointed the blade at Cale, and then at Hannah. He spoke in Apache, his voice a harsh indictment. Cale's jaw clenched. He spoke, his own voice firm and steady, a clear refusal. Gorak shook his head, his eyes hard as granite. He stepped closer to Hannah, the tip of the blade now just inches from her throat. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. "What do you want?" she choked out. Gorak's eyes narrowed. He spoke a single guttural word, then gestured from Cale's wound to the knife. The meaning was brutally clear. A life for a life. Blood for blood. Cale swallowed hard, and with a look of profound despair, he nodded once. Gorak smiled, a cruel, triumphant twisting of his lips, and pressed the knife into Cale's hand. Her heart stopped. Cale stepped forward, his eyes dark with an agony that had nothing to do with his physical wound. He knelt in the dirt before her. The warriors closed in, a suffocating, silent wall. He raised the knife, his gaze locking onto hers. Then he took her hand, placed the flat of the blade against her palm and whispered, his voice breaking, "Prove it." Prove what? That she could be trusted. That she was willing to bleed for him, the way he was bleeding for her. The wind howled, whipping her hair across her face. This was their test. A ritual. A sacrifice. "If you trust me," he rasped, his grip on her hand tightening, "then do it." Her blood ran cold. The blade glinted between them, a line drawn in fear and an impossible choice. As the warriors leaned in, their eyes blazing with anticipation, Hannah knew there was no going back. Her gaze met Cale's, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw not a demand, but a plea. He was trapped, bound by the laws of his people. He was asking her to save him. Summoning a strength she never knew she possessed, she tightened her own grip on the knife handle, took a deep, shuddering breath, and with a swift, clean motion, she drew the blade across her palm. The pain was white-hot, searing, but the gasp that tore from Cale's lips was louder than her own silent scream. Blood welled up instantly, warm and thick, dripping from her hand onto the thirsty ground below, mingling with the dust. A low, reverent hum came from the warriors. It was done. Cale sagged, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. "Hannah," he breathed, his voice breaking. "Why?" She met his gaze, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. "Because," she whispered, her voice raw but steady, "you bled for me. Now, I bleed for you." Gorak stepped back, his face a mask of stunned respect. He knelt, pressing his own palm into the blood-soaked earth, then touched his fingertips to his forehead. One by one, the other warriors did the same. It was an oath. A pledge. Kale's captors released him, and he collapsed in the dirt before her, grabbing her bleeding hand, his blood-smeared fingers wrapping around hers. Their blood mingled, a silent vow forged in pain, witnessed by the setting sun. Gorak rose. "You are one of us now," he said, his voice a low, solemn rumble. Blood shared is a bond that cannot be broken. Part 6. A home forged in fire. 3 days passed in a strange, surreal calm. Gorak and his warriors had vanished back into the vast, indifferent desert, leaving behind only the echo of their threats and the dark, sacred stains of blood in the dirt of her yard. The silence they left behind was heavier than their presence had been. Hannah's hand throbbed beneath the clean bandage Kale had carefully tied for her, each pulse a painful, constant reminder of the sacrifice she had made. But the deeper wound was the silence from Kale himself. He hadn't spoken more than a few necessary words since the ritual. He moved like a ghost through her ranch, his movements fluid and silent as he tended to the horses, chopped a mountain of firewood, and reinforced the crumbling corral. He worked from sunup to sundown, pushing his body relentlessly, as if trying to outrun the thoughts that haunted him. Often she would find him just staring at the horizon, his shoulders tense, as if waiting for the storm to return. The town, too, had grown colder, its silence one of judgment. Her weekly visit to the general store became an ordeal of hostile whispers and sideways glances. Mothers pulled their children closer as she passed. Men who had once tipped their hats now watched her as though she had grown horns, as though she were something monstrous, something untouchable. "You're a fool, Hannah Lynch," Agnes Perkins, the store owner's wife, hissed as Hannah reached for a sack of flour, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "A damn fool to let that savage stay on your land. Mark my words, you'll end up dead, or worse." Hannah didn't respond. She paid for her goods, her chin held high, and walked out, her back rigid against the weight of their hatred. What could she say that they would ever understand? How could she explain a bond forged in blood, a loyalty deeper than race, a connection stronger than fear? Back at the ranch, the silence was finally broken. She found Kale by the well, his shirt off, splashing cool water on his face and chest. His shoulder wound was healing, a puckered, angry scar that she found strangely beautiful. The rest of his torso was a roadmap of older scars, each one telling a story of a life lived on the edge of a blade. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wary. "You should have run," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "When they left, you should have saved yourself." "There was nowhere to run," she said softly. "This is my home." She stepped closer, her heart aching at the distance he kept between them. "And you saved me first, Kale." His jaw clenched, and he looked away, back toward the unforgiving horizon. "You bled for me," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "They will never forget that. And neither will I." A profound guilt radiated from him. He saw her sacrifice not as a gift, but as a burden he had placed upon her. "Then why do you act like you're already gone?" she asked, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Why do you treat me like a stranger?" His broad shoulders sagged. He finally turned to face her fully, and the torment in his eyes made her breath catch. "Because they're not done, Hannah," he said, his voice a hollow whisper. "Gorak will honor the blood bond, but his enemies, they will hear of a white woman who stands with an Apache chief. They will come back. And when they do," he looked down at her, his dark eyes heavy with a sorrow that felt like goodbye, "they will make you choose again." "Choose what?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "Them or me." The wind howled through the canyon then, a mournful, haunting sound that carried the scent of dust and old blood. But Hannah felt no fear. All she felt was a fierce, protective certainty. She closed the distance between them, her small hands reaching up to cup his face, her fingers threading through his damp, dark hair. "I already made my choice, Kale," she said, her voice steady, her gaze fierce and unwavering. "In the barn, when I cleaned your wound. In the yard, when I took that knife. I choose you." His breath shuddered out of him, his eyes closing as if her words were a blow he had been bracing himself against. "Hannah." She didn't let him finish. Rising up on her toes, she silenced him, pressing her lips to his. It was a kiss born of desperation and defiance, of shared pain, and a startling, unbidden hope. Her hands clutched at his bare shoulders, feeling the raw power in him, her heart pounding against his chest. He tasted of dust and water, of smoke and salt, and of something wild, raw, and broken. For a moment he was still, shocked, and then a low groan rumbled in his chest and his arms came around her, crushing her to him. He kissed her back, and all the pent-up hunger, the loneliness, the pain of a lifetime poured into it. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a storm, a wildfire, a claiming. When they finally pulled apart, gasping for breath, he rested his forehead against hers. Their breaths mingled, their hearts beat in a frantic, synchronized rhythm. The world fell away, the hostile town, the vengeful warriors, the blood they had shed. All of it faded into the vast, silent prairie. There was only this. Them. Standing beneath the wide-open sky, two souls from different worlds, bound by blood and sacrifice. "Stay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hand tracing the scar on his face. "Stay with me." Cale's eyes searched hers, the storm within them finally breaking, giving way to a raw, aching vulnerability. "For as long as you'll have me," he said, his voice hoarse. He wrapped his arms around her again, holding her tight against the solid warmth of his body. And as Hannah laid her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, she knew she had finally found the one thing she thought she had lost forever. It wasn't the ranch. It wasn't the land. It was this. This was home. And so, under the vast and watchful sky of the West, a new story began. It wasn't a story of survival anymore, but one of love. A love as wild and untamed as the land that bore it. The Goa fawn and the warrior, the farmer and the chief, found in each other a home that no fire could burn, no hatred could destroy. Their bond, forged in blood and sealed with a kiss, teaches us a profound truth. That home is not a place you build with wood and nails, but a sanctuary you find in another's heart. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to love in spite of it. The greatest frontiers are not on any map. They are the spaces between us, waiting to be crossed with compassion and understanding. Thank you for joining us at Wild West Stories. If this tale of courage and unlikely love moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Like and share this video to help us keep the legends of the West alive. Until next time, ride safe.